LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic references to violence against women. Help is always available at 1-800-RESPECT. Dial 1-800-737-732 or dial Lifeline on 13 11 14. G'day, I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. This week, the complexities of regional bushland policing.
So I knew a lot of the locals, and the locals knew me.
Mark Tregellas is a more than 20-year veteran of the Victorian Police. His career has seen him take on some of country Victoria's strangest and most intense criminal cases.
As I pulled in and my headlights came around, here were three huge guys standing around a girl that was lying face down on the ground.
We'll hear about that situation, but to start, we're going back to when Mark got a call from a distressed woman whose boyfriend had been shot in the stomach.
On this particular evening, I was working with a partner, which happened infrequently, but we received a call that a young 18-year-old lad had a gunshot wound, and the ambulance didn't want to attend at the address until police had gone and checked that it was safe for them to do so and remove any weapons or firearms. We were the only ones that were in the area at the time, and the township of Can River was about an hour from where I was stationed. So we had an hour's drive to get down there. During that drive, we were able to ask for other information. We wanted to know what type of firearms the young guy had, which would give us an idea of perhaps how bad his injuries were. And he had about half a dozen firearms that were, some of them were high-powered rifles. There was a shotgun. There was also a smaller rifle, a 17 HMR, which is similar to just a 22. And we just hoped that perhaps that may have been it rather than anything bigger. Also on the way down, and back in those days, police communications radios were not encrypted, and anyone with a scanner could listen in on what I was asking for or saying to D24. So as we're going further along, we got a radio message from the board which said that a relative of the person has heard us on the scanner, they've phoned up, they've gone around and secured the rifle. So that made us feel a little bit better. We then, a little bit later, got another message from the board via the ambulance that was saying that this young lad's girlfriend was refusing to provide him with first aid. That was worrying. We couldn't work out why that would be, and we started wondering whether or not it may not have been a self-inflicted gun wound and that there may have been something else. So because of that, we asked for some backup, and fortunately one of the TMU units, which is the Highway Patrol, was operating near us. One of the sergeants was there, and his arrival time, because it was going far quicker with the V8s than we were in the four-wheel drives, we would be able to meet in Can River at the local petrol station to formulate a bit of a plan before we went in. So we met up at the petrol station, put on bulletproof vests, and the plan was we'll go around there, we'll secure the firearm, and then we'll let the ambos come in and try and investigate and find out what had happened. So as we're driving down to the address, I look in my rearview mirror and there were 5 cars following us. Turns out that the guy who'd heard us on the scanner had phoned around, and we now had several people in town following us to find out what had happened. So we pulled up outside the address and it was quiet. There was no sign of anyone there. And 5 cars pulled up behind us. So I walked back and told everyone to just remain in their cars until we secure the scene. So I went up, knocked on the door, and the door was answered by a girl who was from Norway and was visiting the region and was the girlfriend of the young lad. We walked in and the 18-year-old guy was lying on his side, holding his stomach, and lying next to him was a firearm. And I checked the firearm. There was an expended cartridge in the breech and it was loaded. We then called the ambulance officers in and they began treating the young guy. I took possession of the firearm, cleared it, and it was the 17 HMR. So that made me feel at least a little bit better that it wasn't a high-powered rifle that would go through. It just had a very small entry wound near his navel with no exit wound. I then decided I'd better check his other firearms and find out if they were secure or not. So I began searching the house and I walked up to this room, opened it up, and walked into what could only be described as the room of death. This young kid's father had a business that sold knives. The business had folded and his father had given him hundreds of bladed weapons. There was not just pen knives or sheath knives. I remember seeing a garbage bin that had about 40 machetes sitting in it. There were fantasy weapons, Viking axes, swords, halyards, spears, and the entire room was absolutely chockers with them. Most of them you can't own. They're considered to be prohibited weapons unless you are a certified collector or you have a business that requires you to have them. The pen knives are fine, but not the 5-foot-long double-edged battle axes that this kid had. The safe that he had his firearms in, and at least he had a safe, was open, and the other firearms were there along with a stack of ammunition. So we took possession of everything whilst the ambulance officers were treating him. And we basically filled up 2 police cars. The back seats and the boot were just chockers. I then went back and asked the young kid, who'd by this stage had been given some penthrane. He was able to talk to us. We asked him what had happened, and he said the gun accidentally went off as he was cleaning it. That was bullshit. I don't know anyone who has ever cleaned a firearm by holding the muzzle pointed at his stomach and then pulling the trigger. I said as much to him and said, look, this is bullshit. You better come up with a better story than that. And he said, I dropped it and it went off. The problem was the firearm was a bolt-action Marlin, and Marlin rifles, the triggers on them have a 2-stage trigger, and they are extremely safe. You could drop a Marlin rifle loaded onto its butt from 50 feet in the air and it would not go off. So we knew that was bullshit as well. And I pointed this out and he said he was refusing to say anything else. So I took his girlfriend aside and said, what happened? And basically they were at a party and apparently there was an argument, and he has walked back and then she has walked back after he's left, and she's come home to find him lying on the floor with a bullet wound. So I asked where the party was, and jumped in the car and went down there. Fortunately, there were some young people that were still at the party, and I was able to say, were these two young people at the party? Yes, they were. They had an argument. What was the reason for the argument? Turns out the young lad had a second girlfriend, and the first girlfriend had found out about it, and that was what the argument was about. So I said, okay, he walked back and then she walked back after that. And they said, no, they both walked back together. So now I've got the young lass lying to me, and I didn't know why. By this stage, the ambulance had decided that the young kid was quite poor, and they were calling in a helicopter to land it on the Oval to pick him up and send him back. So I was about to come back when suddenly the sergeant who had remained at the scene phoned me and said that the young Norwegian girl had disappeared. She'd run off. And I had no idea why. We'd also been informing the sergeant back in Bairnsdale as to what the situation was. But overhearing this, the sergeant's the 250, the 265 is the senior sergeant that operates for the entire region. He was listening in on this and came back to us, and he was not happy. And he said, why is this girl not in handcuffs? Why has she not been arrested? And we were trying to explain that at this stage we didn't know for certain exactly what had happened, but give us a bit of time and I'm sure we're finding that out. Why hadn't the CIB been informed? Why weren't the CIB heading up to you guys? And the reason is simply it's a 2-hour drive for them. And before I call out the CI, I'd kind of like to exhaust all avenues possible of investigation before we actually drop the hammer and get the guys to start coming out here by car. Then I heard the helicopter flying overhead, so I went down to the Oval where the helicopter had landed and the ambulance was there to load the young guy into it. Next to the ambulance was the young Norwegian girl. She hadn't run away. She had just gone down to make certain that her boyfriend was all right and that he got onto the helicopter safely. So I took her aside and said, listen, you told me that you left separately, but everyone down at the park says that you left together. And she said, yes, we left together, but on the way back, I went to see a friend and my boyfriend then left and went back alone. And after I came back from seeing this other person, that I found him lying on the ground with a bullet wound. So I asked who this third person was, and she gave a name. It was a young lad that I knew, but no one knew where he lived. Eventually, one of the locals in the 5 cars that had followed us said he thought he was sleeping in an abandoned house. So I drove down to this house, found it, walked inside, and there was a young kid asleep in the bed. So I woke him up and said I needed to ask some questions. Where were you earlier? He said, I was at the party. And they said, and you came back alone? He said, yes. And I said, did anyone come back with you? And he said, yes, the girl did. And I said, what had happened? And apparently there was some money owed and he paid her some money and she left. So now I knew that she was actually telling the truth and that she wasn't involved in the case. So I went back, explained this to everyone, and they were happy that it, at this stage, did look like a self-inflicted bullet wound. But there's an aside to the story. As the young kid was flying back in the helicopter, his vital signs started to deteriorate, and the paramedic in the back said, he's not going to make it to Sale, we need to land at Bairnsdale. Fortunately for him, a surgeon was operating on that night in Bairnsdale who had only just come from South Africa and was highly experienced in bullet wounds. And he was put on the operating table. They took out a kidney and I think a couple of feet of intestine and saved his life. Further investigation found out that the young kid had previously lost his firearms licence for filing off the serial numbers and selling them to people, but had applied to a magistrate and got his firearms licence back. A couple of months after, he rolled up to the police station wanting to have his firearms back that we had taken. And I had to tell him that that wasn't going to happen, and if he wanted to apply to a magistrate again, but I don't think this time he's going to be allowed to do it. So it was certainly hard because the story was changing constantly. The young Norwegian girl didn't speak that good English. So I think when the ambulance board were trying to get her to apply first aid, she didn't really understand what was happening. We found out the reason that this young kid had shot himself was because he couldn't decide between the Norwegian girlfriend and the local girlfriend, so he decided to shoot himself and see which one gave him the most sympathy.
This is policing in its purest form, isn't it? It's nothing is ever quite as it appears. You can be trucking along, nothing going on, and then suddenly you find yourself immersed in this. There's so many interesting things to unpack about working in a country environment, which you did for over 25 years. The 5 cars of locals, that could go one way or the other, I guess, Mark, can't it? They could be there to assist, or they could actually be there for less honourable reasons.
Exactly. And it wasn't until I went back, and the only beauty of that is that I'd worked in that area for a while, so I knew a lot of the locals, and the locals knew me. But it was quite stunning. I said, "What are you guys doing here?" And they just said, "Oh, we just thought we'd come for a look." And I'm like, "Oh, what? Guys, there's a firearm in here. We don't know what the story is. Just stay in the car until we work out what's going on, would you?" And they go, yeah, sure, no worries. And it worked out good, but it could have gone another way. You just don't know. And a lot of the times, like, that was just 1 hour away. I've attended jobs that have taken me over 3 hours to get to. And I've had to go interstate in order to hook back around to get to some of the really remote areas. And for someone to come and back me up is 3 hours.
The call for backup is the big one for me, Mark. You know, I only ever policed in a city area, but there was one area about a 20-minute, half-hour drive out of there, which was a really, really tough area. And if you got caught there and the proverbial sort of hit the fan, you know, at the quickest, you're 20 minutes, half an hour away from backup. I can't imagine what it's like to be on your own and backup is an hour, 2, 3 hours, because that's basically not backup at all, is it, to be fair, in the immediacy of something happening where you're in danger?
A lot of the times we would carry a lot of extra equipment in the back of the four-wheel drive that was not issued to us. We would have ration packs, cooking gear, camping gear, because there's a possibility that you may go out on a job and suddenly you're there for the night. And you don't want to be sitting in the cab for the entire time freezing. You want to make certain that you're okay. And because we're in the coastal region, I would have another bag which would have a face mask, which would have a wetsuit and fins in it. And we would carry better first aid kits and hiking gear. At some stages, I was actually carrying ropes and rappelling equipment.
Those relationships with the locals, that must be an important part also of policing and enabling those locals to sort of do what you tell them to do or being there to assist you if need be.
True. And what stunned me a bit with this third young fella was that if I was asleep in a bed and I got a tap on the shoulder and it's the local copper asking me questions, my first question is, one, why are you here? But he didn't mind at all. He just said, yeah, sure. He sat up in bed, scratched his head and, what do you need to know? And it was just like, this was a normal everyday event where you're sleeping in an abandoned house and the police tap you on the shoulder. But he was quite relaxed about it, and it was great because I didn't kind of lead him into any conversation. He volunteered the information that I needed to hear, which was fantastic. And then he just said, "Yeah, no worries," and went back to sleep again. I just wandered out. It was just bizarre.
Mark, if I could take you forward to around 2006, you've been in a job a fair while at this time, close to 20 years, and you had a bit of a run-in. A group of local neo-Nazi lads at Mallacoota assaulting a young woman in the front of a pub. Can you just have a bit of a chat to us about that incident?
Yes, I'll remember this one till the day I die. I was off duty at the time, and my wife and I were living in a flat which was only a couple of 100 metres away from the pub. And I think it was about 11:30 at night, I got a phone call from the publican, and he said, "Listen, can you come up? There's 3 guys and they are beating a woman out the front of the pub." And I'm trying to get the sleep out of my system, and I said, "I'm not on call." And back in those days, you would have somebody who was designated to be on call that could attend. "Have you phoned 000?" And they said, "Yes, but it's Mick. He's coming from Cairn River and he's an hour away. I think they're going to kill her." So I said, "Okay, I'll come up." I then phoned 000 myself and spoke to the board, and I said, "Is Mick going to this job?" And they said, "Yes, but he's 40 minutes away." And I said, "Do you want me to go?" And they said, "Well, we can't authorise your call out because you're not on call." And I said, "Well, it sounds a bit more serious than that. How about I go up in my own car and I'll have a bit of a look and phone you back to give you an idea of just how bad this is." So I just stepped straight out of bed and I'm basically in my pyjamas. And I walked out, jumped into my car, which at the time was a little blue Mitsubishi Magna, and took off round the pub. So the main street in Mallacoota is the centre of it is a car park area. And as I pulled in and my headlights came around and illuminated the interior of the car park, here were 3 huge guys and standing around a girl that was lying face down on the ground. So I got out of the car and all 3 guys started walking towards me. I had to make a choice. Do I stay or do I go? Fortunately, I glanced into the back seat of the Magna, and sitting on there was my martial arts training bag, and on top was a wooden samurai sword. It's called a bokken. It's made of white oak. The wood is exceptionally hard. So I opened up the back door, grabbed that, and I held it up behind my left arm. And I walked over, and then the big guy started coming in. And the other guys started sort of moving off to the left and right. And that really started to spike my adrenaline. And he took a swing. I ducked under the swing and then basically did a 45-degree cut with the wooden samurai sword, and I impacted his right thigh between his hip and his knee, and he just screams and hits the ground. And he's rolling on the ground, holding his leg, screaming his lungs out. He's yelling, "You broke my leg, I'm going to sue." At that stage, the ambulance rolls up and Dave starts applying first aid to her. Now, she had actually ruptured a spleen and had to have surgery. About 20 minutes after that, Mick arrived and I was able to help him with the offenders. And it turns out all 3 were recently released from prison. They were neo-Nazis from New South Wales, and they had known the girl and had come down to Mallacoota to celebrate being released from prison, but she was refusing to let them back into her car where there was a slab of beer. So one stood on her throat while the other one kicked her between the legs until she went unconscious.
Just on that, Mark, amazing. All three are taken into custody, recently released from prison. I'm hoping that there is, in some way, a decent ending to the story. They would have been charged, I would hope, with, the assaults, grievous bodily harm on this young woman. Did they feel the wrath of the law? Did they receive custodial sentences, or what happened at the...
Yes, so they were basically charged. I believe the CIB in Bairnsdale took on all three of the briefs, and they charged them. They went back to prison. What was nice was that the young girl came back a few months afterwards and walked into the police station and personally thanked me, which is really nice. That doesn't happen.
Was she a local girl from Mallacoota?
No, I'd never met any of them before. I had no idea where they'd come from.
When it did happen, Mark, I just wondered, can I ask, how was that? How did that feel? How did you respond to that?
That sort of thing does not happen often, but when it does, it's just fantastic. The young girl walked in and she was smiling, she was happy. It wasn't just sort of there. We invited her in, we sat her down, we had a cup of tea and some bickies, and basically got to know her a little bit. And I think we probably spent maybe about 3/4 of an hour just chatting about what it was like and about the night, and whether or not she had any questions she wanted to ask us. So it was really good. I think the guy with the bald head was an ex-boyfriend of hers, and they contacted her when she got out, and she thought that would be great and that only he would be there. But when the other three came, she had her worries about what might happen later, and then when she sort of ran outside, they were chasing her. So she was running through the car park screaming, and the three guys were running after her. And I remember speaking to Lee's Takeaway, is a little takeaway shop that was there, and Lee's wife at the time was in the shop, and she remembers hearing the screaming, and she looked out the window. She was very scared with these three thugs chasing this guy. But then she saw my headlights coming up a short time later and thought it was the police at the time. So she did that. So all these little things that sort of happened that I didn't know till afterwards. But the feeling you get inside is it's just fantastic. I don't think I ever had that, though, in the city. It only ever happened in the country, where people have been able to come back and actually come into the station in person and thank you for what you've done.
Mark, I just want to thank you so very much for coming in. You've had a bit of a drive from Mallacoota there, where you're still living after policing there for many, many years, and I'm sure that many folks listening in who are very interested to sort of hear about policing and the ins and outs of it. This has been very unique, Mark, because you've taken us on a journey into, those police who still to this day work in these small towns, often on their own, back up, as you say, 3 hours away. And thanks for your service to those good people. Thanks for coming and having a chat. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Brent Sanders, produced by Ed Gooden, and sound designed and imaged by Link Kelly.